Trent Horn, in a recent video, said that children should be taught natural law so that children can understand teleology and therefore they can better combat this stuff. In context, he was talking specifically about the idea that there are no actual ends, there are just things that are common. But in the context of the whole video, he was specifically talking about like gay rights. Trent Horn thinks that gay marriage shouldn't be legal. Gay people shouldn't have the same rights as everybody else because of natural law. And kids don't often understand this, so we need to teach them natural law at a younger age. Let me play you the clip of Trent Horn saying that, but then I'll also present an edited version of that clip because the context that he's talking about it in is a little bit weird. Here's the full clip.
Oh, and there's no such thing as normal or way things that are supposed to be, just things that are statistically common. That's why we need to teach children about things like natural law to combat this stuff.
If you think that I am about to mischaracterize Trent's position, then watch my clip and then please go watch Trent's original video. It's linked in the description down below and tell me what you think I got wrong. But here is how I am going to mush together what Trent's point was.
That's why we need to teach children about things like natural law to combat this stuff.
To combat what stuff? To combat the idea that
there's no such thing as normal or way things that are supposed to be, just things that are statistically common.
And no, Trent, we should not be teaching our kids about natural law for two reasons. Number one, natural law fails as a physical theory, and number two, natural law fails as an ethical theory. In fact, I'll argue that natural law is just divine command theory wearing a toga. Let's begin. You know what's funny is that maybe a week or so after watching Trent's video that we just watched a clip of, the clip where he said that we need to teach kids about natural law, I started watching the Netflix show called The Three Body Problem. That show is science fiction, emphasis on fiction, so don't get all bent out of shape about the clip that I'm about to play, but I wanted to share this clip from episode 7, about 9 minutes in.
Aristotle thought false humility was just as bad as arrogance.
Aristotle thought that rocks fell down instead of up because they loved the ground.
Okay, that's not really accurate. Aristotle he never wrote that rocks loved the ground, but this does kind of set the tone for this section about how natural law fails as a physical theory. Now, I can already hear the Thomists.
Kevin, of course natural law fails as a physical theory. It's not a theory about physics. Natural law has nothing to do with physics.
And great. Since we already agree that natural law fails as a physical theory, I will keep this section short. Short by my standards, anyway. And then we can spend considerably more time talking about how natural law fails as an ethical theory. But briefly, in order to talk about Aristotelian physics, I think we should start by saying that Aristotle didn't do experimentation. He wrote a work, titled by the word physics, but it's not the physics that we understand physics to be today. Aristotle was trying to come to conclusions about the physical world using processes that we today would most likely label philosophy. Back then, though, there was just kind of no distinction between the two. And today, we know that philosophy is not a super useful tool for coming up with true beliefs about the physical world. To back up this point, I am going to quote from Aristotle's Physics, A Physicist's Look, a 2014 article that is linked in full in the description down below. This paper actually tries to defend Aristotle, saying that even though Aristotle is wrong about things, we really shouldn't be so hard on him. After all, says the author, Einstein proved Newton wrong, but we still appreciate Newtonian physics. Sure, Newton got things wrong, but, we teach kids about Newton in school, and if you asked any kind of, scientifically informed person if they had a positive or negative view of Newton, they would all say positive. And Newton did to Aristotle what Einstein did to Newton, according to this paper. But we should still appreciate Aristotle's physics, and we kind of don't. So this paper is sympathetic, but it starts off by saying that most physicists don't appreciate Aristotle's physics at all. Aristotle's physics does not enjoy good press. It is commonly called blatantly wrong. Aristotelian physics, in particular, is now standardly taken as a paradigm of Aristotle's use of the dialectical method, understood as a largely conceptual or a priori technique of inquiry, appropriate for philosophy, as opposed to the more empirical inquiries that we these days now typically regard as scientific. In other words, Aristotle's science is either not science at all, or to the extent that it is science, it's a failure. The paper then goes on to outline some of Aristotle's failures, which again, this author is actually being very charitable to. On page 2, he outlines Aristotle's view of motion, that there are two types of motion, natural motion and violent motion. Violent motion is like when I throw a rock upwards, it's going to go up, but then eventually it's going to fall back down. The motion of the rock up is violent motion, and the motion of the rock back down is natural motion, because the rock has a natural desire to be on the ground. Not desire like as in it actually loves the ground. Not the clip from the science fiction show isn't actually accurate, but the rock has a nature such that it wants, such that the nature is that the rock should be on the ground, and so it takes violent motion to put the rock up. No kind of natural motion will make the rock go up. Modern physics simply has no such theory of violent motion versus natural motion. There are no two types of motion. It's all just motion. Another thing is that Aristotle thought that the speed at which an object falls is proportionate to the weight of the object, as well as the density of the medium in which that object is falling. On page 3, the author talks about how, if Aristotle is right, objects falling in a perfect void would fall at infinite speed. For this exact reason, Aristotle concludes that it is evident that void does not exist. Obviously, we know that's not true. In fact, an object in a perfect void would be perfectly motionless, not falling at all, since there would be no other matter to which the two objects would move towards one another due to the force of gravity. Okay, I said I was going to keep this section short. I think that's enough examples. We all agree anyway. Aristotle's physics was not accurate. That is why, even though Aristotle proposed two different kinds of motion, since modern physics does not have any need of two different kinds of motion to explain the physical world, we have all kind of just stopped believing in two different kinds of motion. And even though Aristotle proposed 4 different kinds of causes, since modern physics has no use of 4 different kinds of causes to explain the physical world, we've all stopped believing in those 4 different kinds of causes. Except we haven't. Not all of us. Most of us, but Catholics, at least the more orthodox ones, they still hold to Aristotle's 4th cause, the final cause, the telos, the end or the purpose. Catholics think that the final causation is an accurate way to explain the world, though perhaps not the physical world. They'll argue that teleology explains the ethical world, perhaps. Metaphysics is not physics, after all. I find this odd, though. Imagine that someone forwarded the argument that, sure, Aristotle's description of motion doesn't describe the physical world, but it does describe the metaphysical world. The motion of one substance into or out of some accidents, such as the kind of things that happens during transubstantiation, is violent motion, since the natural motion of a substance would be to stay exactly where it is. Now, the hairs on the back of Ed Feser's neck have just stood up on end, because what I said right there is nonsense. We do not use natural motion and violent motion to describe the motion of anything. Not in the physical world, and not even in the completely non-empirical realm of metaphysics. With good reason, too. We shouldn't be using violent motion and natural motion to explain anything. They don't have any kind of explanatory power that the regular laws of physics have. But But all the exact same stuff applies to Aristotelian causation, and for some reason, Catholics are still holding on to Aristotelian causation. When I was a trad, talking about final ends seemed natural to me. But now talking about final ends seems just as alien to me as talking about violent motion and natural motion. And it's not just me, it's like the entire scientific community. Okay, though, like I said, we already agree here. So now let's talk about why natural law still fails, even when we relegate it to only being an ethical theory. All right. Even though I clearly do not grant that final causation is a real thing that somehow accurately describes the world, or at least the metaphysical world, I'm going to grant that final causation is a real thing for the sake of this entire section. In order to analyze natural law as an ethical theory, I am granting that natural law is, in some sense, veridical. The first reason why natural law fails as an ethical theory is related to why it fails as a physical theory. Because of the non-empirical nature of these final ends, something that all proponents of natural law admit to, right? No proponent of natural law thinks that like it's empirical in any sense. Knowledge of which things have final ends and which final ends they have is extremely difficult to know with any certainty, if not totally impossible to know with any degree of certainty. Final causes, teloi, since they do not fall into the realm of the physical world, must be considered an abstract object. And all abstract objects are causally inert. If this is the case, then, according to the SEP, the SEPS article called Nominalism in Metaphysics, it is difficult to understand how we can have knowledge or reliable belief about any abstract objects, which would include final causes. Given the causal inertness of abstract objects, it cannot explain how linguistic or mental reference to such abstract objects is even possible. And this is a well-understood problem that even the fiercest proponents of realism about abstract objects acknowledge. Dr. David Oderberg, he wrote Real Essentialism, which is considered by many to be essential reading for the philosophically minded Catholic, pun intended. But Carlo Broussard actually recommended that book to me one time when I called into Catholic Answers. But Dr. Oderberg admits that all of this stuff is super vague. On page 226 of Real Essentialism, in a section called Section 9.3, Vagueness, Oderberg writes, apparent vagueness in species must be taken seriously as a metaphysical issue, just as in other areas. I do not, however, propose to offer a solution to the problem of vagueness here. It is not even clear whether there is a single solution to all of the different sorts of case vagueness can throw up. Or, even if there is a single solution, it is not clear whether there is a single method for handling vagueness in every area. Even though we might be able to enunciate some principles that govern all cases, vagueness seems to infect everything. Accidents, properties, substances, essences, other kinds of beings such as collections and aggregates, laws, parts, causes, languages, and so on throughout ontology, language, thought, and reasoning. This vagueness in what abstracta are seems pretty problematic for anyone who hopes to use natural law in an ethical theory. As an example, the person who wants to use natural law might want to say that the form of a man has the telos of to procreate. Therefore, gay relations are immoral because they frustrate the telos of man. But in The Unnecessary Science, author Gunther Laird proposes that, with regard to male homosexuality, I argue it is plausible that gay men instantiate a form and thus possess a different sexual final cause than straight men, meaning that quote-unquote sodomy is not necessarily a contravention of the purpose of their sexual faculties. In that same chapter, author Gunther Laird he writes that if gay people have their own particular form, it also stands to reason that what is good for them may actually be different than what is good for heterosexual people. After all, the good, in the sense of fulfilling one's function, is different for creatures with different forms. To reuse Feser's favorite example, it is good for a squirrel to scamper up trees and eat nuts, but it would starve if it tried to visit many flowers and eat pollen. A bee, on the other hand, is a good bee to the extent that it visits flowers and gathers their pollen, and a bad, sickly bee if it buzzes around trees all day and attempts to bring nuts larger than it is back to its hive. Given this understanding, perhaps what is bad for people like me, and assumedly given his 6 children, Dr. Feser, is actually good for homosexuals, given their different forms. The final cause of our heterosexual sexual faculties may be to procreate, yes. But perhaps the final cause of a homosexual's sexual faculties is something different, like social bonding. There is nothing in this assessment that specifically contradicts Aristotelian metaphysical thought. No denial of realism, final causality, or essences. Merely the postulation that a certain group might have a slightly different form than the rest of us, and therefore a different final cause with regard to one of their faculties. Now, I can already hear the scoffing from the Thomists.
There's no such thing as the form of a gay man, just the form of man. I can't believe that you'd even suggest such a thing. That is not based at all.
Let's keep reading. Gunther Laird said that since gay men do have their own form, all of these problems disappear. At least it would be so if homosexuals truly did instantiate their own form. But perhaps they do not. Isn't homosexuality merely a behavior or a preference for a certain behavior? We wouldn't say that people who simply do different things or partake in different hobbies have different forms. For instance, we could note some people enjoy baseball and others enjoy football, but we wouldn't say football fans and baseball fans have different forms. Well, actually, we would, and we should, as the very existence of the two terms attests. If forms really do exist, as Feser and his natural law friends would say, anything that exists and can be distinguished in any way from any other existing thing has a form. Given that there is clearly some difference between football fans and baseball fans, they must instantiate forms in some way. This would remain the case, at least according to David Oderberg, even if there were some sort of vagueness in the form of homosexuality, distinct from the form of heterosexuality, even if some people participate in both to a certain extent, namely bisexuals, or no extent, people who feel no sexual attraction or arousal at all, namely asexuals. Thus, some form of same-sex union could plausibly exist and serve a legitimate purpose, regardless of whether one calls it marriage or something else. Now, here's the weird thing. I have read a decent amount of Feser, and I am confused by the average YouTube Catholic's view of how natural law ethics are supposed to work. So far, I have been addressing natural law ethics as if it is always good to fulfill a final cause, and it's always bad to frustrate a final cause. But that's not how natural law works, according to the actual natural law philosophers like Feser and Oderberg. In my defense, though, lots of YouTube Catholics do talk as if it's always wrong to frustrate the end of any act. Let me show you what I mean.
That's why I would say the best expression of what sex is for is to say, sex is for the expression of marital love.
I mean, if you actually look at human anatomy, it seems like sex was designed to make sure that men impregnate as many women as possible all the time. A woman might be able to only have one child every 9 months or so, but a man remains fertile and can happily sire children with other women constantly, while each one is busy baking the bun in her oven. This is even apparent in the nature of sperm and eggs. Men produce literally trillions of sperm over the course of their lifetimes, while women only produce a few hundred at most egg cells. This is all very puzzling if nature and or God intended humans to be monogamous. One would expect semen production to shut down over the course of a wife's pregnancy, perhaps triggered by hormones. Or perhaps men might produce limited numbers of sperm proportionate to a woman's relatively tiny supply of eggs. But none of that obtains in reality. And that's just the thing. Catholics don't actually think that morality is just synonymous with the good that occurs when a telos is fulfilled. Catholics don't think that there is anything morally praiseworthy about a triangle that has straight sides, as opposed to a triangle that was sloppily drawn with curved sides. One is better at being a triangle than the other. Likewise, straight marital acts are better for procreation than non-straight marital acts. But that doesn't give them a moral status. It's completely morality neutral, this objective determination of whether or not something is fulfilling its telos. Ed Feser makes this exact point in Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide. It is of the essence of a triangle to be a closed plane figure with 3 straight sides, and anything with this essence must have a number of properties, such as having angles adding up to 180 degrees. These are straightforward objective facts and remain so even though there are triangles which fail perfectly to match this description. A triangle drawn hastily on a cracked plastic seat of a moving bus might fail to have sides that are perfectly straight, and thus its angles will add up to something other than 180 degrees. Even a triangle drawn slowly and carefully on art paper with a straight edge and a radiograph pen will contain subtle flaws. Still, the latter will more perfectly approximate the essence of triangularity than the former will. It will be a better triangle than the former one. Indeed, we would naturally call the former a bad triangle and the latter a good one. This judgment would be completely objective. It would be silly to suggest that it reflects nothing more than a subjective preference for triangles with angles that add up to 180 degrees. It would be equally silly to suggest that we have somehow committed a fallacy in making a value judgment about the badness of triangles drawn on the bus seat on the basis of the facts about the essence of triangularity. Given that essence, the value judgment in question obviously follows necessarily. This example illustrates how an entity can count as an instance of a certain kind of a thing even if it fails perfectly to instantiate the essence of that kind of thing. A badly drawn triangle is not a non-triangle, but a defective triangle. It also illustrates how there can be perfectly objective, factual standards of goodness and badness, better or worse. To be sure, the standard in question in the current example is not a standard of moral goodness. Okay, wait. So if fulfilling the telos of just any random thing like triangularity isn't what makes something moral, then why have we been stressing out about the telos of the procreative act? And what makes something moral anyway? Is it only certain final causes are actually in the running for things that determine morality? And if so, how do we determine which final causes actually correspond with morality while which don't? How do we make that determination? Well, if we keep reading in Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide, we find out. Feser talks about how we humans, being rational animals, have a specific end. And it is one specific end from which we derive all of our morality. And no, that end is not procreation. So the person throughout history who had the most kids isn't necessarily the most morally upright person who's ever lived. So what is that end, that telos, from which we derive all of our morality? It cannot be wealth. It cannot be honor. It cannot be fame or glory, nor can it be power. It cannot be pleasure. It cannot be found in any created thing whatsoever. Our ultimate end could only be something which lulls the appetite altogether, beyond which nothing more could be desired, and thus something absolutely perfect. And this is to be found, Aquinas concludes, not in any creature, but in God alone. Wherefore God alone can satisfy the will of man. God alone constitutes man's happiness. That is not to deny that wealth, honor, fame, power, pleasure, and the goods of the body and soul have their place. They cannot fail to do so, given that we are the kinds of creatures that we are. Aquinas' point is that it is impossible for them to be the highest or ultimate good for us, that to which every other good is subordinated. God alone can be that. Wait a minute. Isn't this just divine command theory? Our final cause, our purpose, our end, our telos, from which all of our morality is derived, is just doing what God wants us to do? That's just divine command theory, isn't it? Well, Feser says no, because what is good for us is necessarily good for us because it follows from our nature. As such, even God couldn't change it any more than he could make 2 and 2 equal 5. Here we see one important consequence of Aquinas' view, that the intellect is metaphysically prior to the will, in the sense that, as we saw in the last chapter, will derives from intellect rather than vice versa. The divine intellect knows the natures of things, and the divine will creates in accordance with this knowledge. To be sure, the natures in question exist first only as ideas in the divine mind itself. In this sense, they are, like everything else, dependent on God. Still, in creating the things that are to have these natures, the divine will only ever creates in light of the divine ideas, and never in a way that conflicts with what is possible, given the content of those ideas. Aquinas' position is thus very far from the sort of divine command ethics, according to which what is good merely because God wills it, so that absolutely anything, including torturing babies for fun, say, could have been good for us had he willed it to be that way. And I have to admit that I don't understand this at all. Because God could not have commanded otherwise, therefore, the fact that what is moral is fulfilling all of God's commands is still not divine command theory? I'm totally cool with Feser wanting to say that God couldn't have commanded otherwise. I know that Feser's not on board with modal collapse, but I am. So if I were to believe in the Thomistic God with the doctrine of divine simplicity, I would believe that all, divine simplicity would collapse all possibilities into the ones that have and will play out. God was never free. God did what God was always going to do in this ultra-deterministic universe of divine simplicity. But how does this make it the case that morality isn't divine command theory just because God couldn't have commanded any differently? I don't see how that's not divine command theory anymore. And guess what? Less than 10 pages later, Feser kind of agrees with me. He says, there is, from the Thomistic point of view, some truth after all in the divine command theory of ethics, even if it is far from the whole story, and even though the commands in question are emphatically not arbitrary ones. So it is divine command theory. It always has been divine command theory. Maybe divine command theory after it went to college and studied scholasticism, but still. And here's the thing. Mother Angelica knew this. I think that most lay Catholics, at least Orthodox lay Catholics, just kind of intuit this, that it is divine command theory at the end of the day. Listen to this clip of Mother Angelica talking about why homosexuality is a sin.
Why is homosexuality a sin? Who said so? God said so. The church is giving you the word of God.
Mother Angelica didn't say, well, you see, it's actually the final end, or telos, of all rational animals, that is to say, humans, that we follow the will of God. And there's something special about this telos in particular that makes it the telos from which all of morality is measured. And God said don't be gay, so therefore being gay is a sin. No, she just cut to the chase. God said so. Say one thing about Mother Angelica, say she was direct. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Should we
teach children about things like natural law to combat? There's no such thing as normal or a way things are supposed to be, just things that are statistically common.
I don't think we should, since this is literally just divine command theory. Although Trent probably would just double down anyway and say, yes, we should teach our kids to obey God's commands. And to that I say, fine, okay, Trent. But please be honest about where this morality comes from. You can try to dress up your reasons for being homophobic in the trappings of scholasticism all you want so that you sound more philosophical. But at the end of the day, you're just telling people not to be gay because God said so. And that might be enough for you, Trent. You might be satisfied by that. That it's wrong because some writers 2,000 years ago were convinced that it was wrong and those books made it into the final canon. But that's not good enough for me. And it shouldn't be good enough for you either, dear audience. To all of my Catholic listeners and my non-Catholic listeners who are opposed to gay marriage or opposed to letting gay couples adopt, you are actively lobbying to try to take away the rights of gay people. So you better be damn sure that this is justified, whatever justification might look like to you. if you think that because a text was written 2,000 years ago says so, and that's enough justification to take rights away from people, then I just hope you never vote.